All right. Good afternoon. Thank everybody for joining us today. We all hope that you're enjoying the summit so far. For those of you I haven't met yet, I'm with OCFS and the Division of Youth Partnerships for Success. My name's Robin Gilbert. In the role I currently have, I work with Runaway and homeless youth programs throughout New York State, as well as with the Safe Harbor New York program. Just want to thank everybody again for being here. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items to go over. First, if you encounter any IT issues with the presentations, you can email info@welfareresearch.org. Help will be sent your way. If you have an IT issue during the presentation, you can type the issue into the chat box and one of us will attempt to assist you. All presentations are going to be recorded and will be posted in HSLC for future viewings. Materials from the presentations will be emailed out next week, and we'll also be sending out a post-summit survey. Please use this as an opportunity to provide feedback about the event so that we can incorporate it into future sessions. If you would like a certificate for your participation, they can be issued after the summit. They can be requested by sending your name and email address to Christine Anderson here at OCFS. Lastly, participants are automatically muted during each presentation. Our presenter has about 45 minutes of content and will reserve about 15 minutes for questions and answers at the end. If you have a question or comment during the presentation, you can go ahead and put those in the Q&A box on your screen. We'll get to as many as that time will allow at the end. And of course, if we don't get to the question because we run out of time, we do have the ability to see the questions in the presentation. At the conclusion of the presentation, we'll get you an answer as quickly as possible. So now I would like to introduce this afternoon's presenter. Joining us is Melanie Porto Conti from Captain Community Services. She currently serves as the Schenectady County Safe Harbor Coordinator, advocating for individuals who have been trafficked. She's also a professor at Sage Graduate School, where she educates professionals about trafficking and travels the country providing the HEAL training and acting as an advocate. We are very excited to have her here with us today. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Melanie now.
Hi, everybody. Get my screen up here. Oops. Okay, so we're going to be talking about preventing suicide for runaway, trafficked, and homeless youth in the time of COVID. And in my previous life, I was the Director of Suicide Prevention for the New York State Office of Mental Health. But there was a suicide cluster in my home county of Schenectady back in 2008, and 2009 and 2010, which involved trafficked girls in our community. So this is where my suicide prevention background and my passion for working with runaway, trafficked, and homeless youth began. So we will begin. First, what I'd like you to do is raise your hand if you have had experience with suicide, either personally, having lost someone or know someone who struggles with thoughts of suicide, professionally, if you have worked with people who've had thoughts of suicide, attempted suicide, or have actually taken their own lives, or if you're currently working with a youth who is struggling with thoughts of suicide. Raise your hand so we can see what's going on. So everybody can just raise your hands. There's a little function that will allow you to do that. Can everybody see how to raise your hand?
Hi guys, this is Christine. If you can't figure out how to raise your hand, feel free to type in the chat if you'd like to.
Sounds good. Okay, so everybody knows the definition of runaway and homeless youth, so I won't linger on this too long, but we're seeing a lot of different trends now in the time of COVID, and we do have a number of runaway and homeless youth who may or may not be seen in our shelters. Okay, so as we know, trafficked, homeless, and runaway youth are at heightened risk for serious behavioral, emotional, and general health problems, and we found that to be absolutely true. As we know, trafficked RHY youth are a diverse population by race, ethnicity, gender, identity, sexual orientation, and pathways to homelessness. So, things we do know. The trafficked homeless youth are more likely to experience mental health disorders such as PTSD, depression, suicidal ideation. And a 2014 study of homeless youth said that homeless youth are likely to have 4 times greater to have a psychiatric disorder than the national average of youth in the same age group, 82% and 19% respectively. And that's from the National Healthcare for Homelessness Council. So, in a smaller study in 2008 that noted that 44% of homeless youth reported attempting suicide. A larger study in 2008 concluded that 52% of the participants had multiple lifetime suicide attempts, and 2/3 had thoughts of suicide within the year prior to the survey. These numbers are higher and situations are exacerbated when trafficked youth, due to many factors, always have complex trauma issues. So we're going to talk in a little bit about how COVID has caused these numbers to go up even more. Okay. So there's an increased prevalence of suicidal ideation among homeless youth who've been sex trafficked. We don't have any good data yet on youth who have been labor trafficked, although there have been a few instances that have been brought to my attention in New York State of youth who have been labor trafficked who have taken their own lives, particularly a case a couple of years ago on Long Island. Okay. So a 2019 study for 16 to 25-year-olds found that 53% of homeless youth queried via the Youth Experiences Survey reported experiencing suicidal ideation during their lifetime. Sex-trafficked homeless youth were 3.87 times higher in reporting suicidal ideation. So just think about that. That's the majority of sex-trafficked homeless youth. Of those trafficked youth reporting suicidal ideation, 84.4% of those youth had attempted suicide in their lifetime. Okay, so we know suicide is the second leading cause of death among youth, and findings from a national survey said that I think probably you're all familiar with. 17% of students said they had seriously considered suicide in the past year. 13% had formed a plan to take their own life. 8% had 1 or more suicide attempts and were considering suicide. Now, this is among the general population of youth. Take those numbers we just were shown and think about how that is exacerbated for a trafficked youth. Okay? So why are youth suicidal? They're in crisis. We know our trafficked youth, our kids who are runaways and homeless, are in crisis by the very virtue that they're on the street, because they are in a trafficking situation that they feel they can't necessarily get out of, because they're in foster care, because they have an unstable home life, and they feel they have lack of resources and support. Okay, so I just want to take a little bit of time to talk about why all these things are exacerbated in the time of COVID. For those kids that haven't necessarily run away yet, they're feeling lonely, isolated, disconnected. They have a lot of time to be unsupervised on social media, as we've talked about. If they have had, as we talked about in this morning session, some self-generated sexual abuse material, have been involved in extortion or just exploration and are being shamed now, this greatly increases these suicide risk factors. If you have underlying mental illness like depression, anxiety, PTSD, alcohol and substance use dependency, prior suicide attempts, non-suicidal self-injury, exposure to family and friend suicide, and this was particularly, as I was telling about the suicide cluster in Schenectady back in 2008 and 9, one of the things that seemed to move the cluster along was because so many friends or family member were taking their own lives. So it made a highly suggestible group even more suggestible to suicide. It lowered the threshold of acceptability. And another suicide risk factor is low self-esteem. Okay. So other additional risk factors for suicide are aggressive or impulsive behaviors, a past abuse or other trauma. Think about that in the context of a trafficked youth, a loss of an important relationship. By virtue of being sex trafficked, runaway, or homeless, they will have lost important relationships or perceive that they have access to pills, firearms, or other means of self-harm, physical illnesses, stressful life events, inadequate or neglectful parenting, having mentally ill and or substance abusing parents. Think about these in context of our trafficked youth, exacerbated them by them being out on the streets or going into a shelter, leaving the shelter and being back out on the streets. Think about those and how it exacerbates. So, as I said, let's talk about the impact of COVID. We've noted significant increases in instances of commercial sexual exploitation of children, as well as sex and labor trafficking overall. Local, state, and national increases have been noted according to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, as well as through the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children tip line, which we heard from earlier. There's been a 90% increase in calls reporting the instances of child sexual exploitation, particularly stemming from online encounters since COVID quarantines began. So this kind of dovetails into what we've been learning over the last 3 days, because kids are even more vulnerable being online, being more vulnerable because they're being shamed, they're being exploited. Of the kids that we're personally working with in Schenectady County, in many of these situations, they are being shamed either by their peers or their loved ones that they got themselves into this exploitive situation. So just think about how that exacerbates the thoughts of suicide. And hospitalizations related to suicidal ideation are up as well because of this. So locally, we've seen a dramatic increase in trafficking or sexual exploitation instances from 11 through 14-year-olds, particularly at local middle schools. Much of these instances started when the in-person school safety net disappeared with COVID-related school changes. As we talked about, youth have more access to unmonitored screen time. Many of the youth now feel isolated without in-person contact with their peers. They're looking for any kind of a connection with others over the internet. And as we talked about previously, oftentimes low self-esteem is a suicide risk factor anyway. And you think about the combination of a youth who has low self-esteem, they aren't feeling any kind of connections, they're making connections with strangers, often local strangers over the internet, social media, and various apps, which makes it easier for the predators, who are oftentimes people they know from the community or familiar with, help to lure the youth into exploitive situations. Again, as we talked about, particularly for posting nudes, sextortion, all of those things we've talked about in our previous sessions. In addition, parental distraction by consequences of COVID may lead to children spending increased unsupervised time on the internet. If the children lack self-protective online skills, they're at increased risk of exploitation in the form of sexual solicitation, grooming, sextortion, production and distribution of child sex abuse materials, and engaging in live stream sex acts. Sometimes this is a precursor to them leaving home, running away, and sometimes going to meet these predators. So it can be a very deadly mix. Okay. Another thing we need to think about is the diminished protections out there and prevention opportunities. For the mandated reporters, contact with children and vulnerable adults is greatly reduced, if even eliminated. Online contact by teachers, health professionals, and victim service providers is restricted, and there are challenges in detecting violence and exploitation. Police may be distracted from anti-trafficking activities by the need to respond to COVID conditions. In addition, healthcare providers have limited access to telehealth, telemental health, or very rushed in-person patients, clients, and emergency departments. And their focus may be on COVID-19 concerns rather than exploitation and trafficking. This is a very distinct reality in our world right now. So we just don't have as many eyes on the kids, particularly the runaway and homeless youth who have been trafficked. So we as the community agency serving vulnerable runaway and homeless youth must remain vigilant in identifying and serving our most at-risk kids in this unprecedented time. Never in all my 40 years of doing this have I seen such an unprecedented time with such a unique set of circumstances. I mean, suicide is on the rise in the United States anyway, and was before COVID, but we're seeing it exponentially rise with COVID, and particularly with our most vulnerable trafficked runaway and homeless youth. So we can't change a family history of suicide or undo a loss of a key relationship, but you can connect to a youth to be an effective treatment program or supportive care provider, okay? When one study found that youth with 3 protective factors had a 70 to 85% lower risk of suicide attempts, whether or not they had other risk factors. The risk and protective factors are dynamic, meaning they're always changing. So what are those things? Let's talk about it a little bit. So protective factors, which we can enhance, whether somebody is in a shelter, we meet them during street outreach, we can help them to have a close, caring relationship with an adult, good peer relationships, general connectedness to school, family, etc. Even in this environment, safe school and safe environment, okay? Much more difficult now than it was pre-COVID. Reduced access to firearms, alcohol, and substances, prescription medication, doing activities that heightens their self-esteem and spirituality and faith. So there's a lot of things we can do with outreach, even these times of COVID, to enhance these protective factors. Other things that help youth, effective mental and physical health care and substance use treatment. Again, it's been a challenge with telehealth, sometimes long waiting lists, sometimes telehealth is good, but it doesn't have the level of engagement and eyes on the youth as it did pre-COVID. Consistent and supportive relationships with healthcare providers and help providing problem solving and conflict resolution. So how do we help our at-risk youth, those trafficked, runaway, and homeless youth, and the youth in general? So we need to learn the facts. And what comprises the facts we need to learn? We have to learn about their feelings, look at their actions, look at the changes in their behavior, the threats that they're making, and the situations that they are in. So those feelings we have to gauge, whether we can see them in person or whether it's through online Zoom calls or Google Meets, Google Hangouts. We have to assess their sense of hopelessness, and they'll express it. If you do art therapy programs, or somebody was doing yoga yesterday from Chautauqua, assess what you're sensing, what you're feeling or seeing with the youth. Do they seem to be expressing hopelessness about their situation, about COVID, about being homeless, about being a runaway? Assess those feelings. Assess their feelings of fear. Are they worried about getting COVID? Are they worried about their trafficker, their predator? Are they worried where their next meal or their next night's sleep will be? Gauge those feelings. Do they feel helpless in their situation? Do they feel worthless? Are you seeing self-hate, guilt, or shame? Are you seeing extreme sadness or loneliness? anxiety, or worry. Those are the feelings you're going to see and sense about our youth. They may have all of those, or they may have one of those. So what can we look at through actions? Drug or alcohol abuse, talking about death or destruction, aggression. Particularly, we've seen this oftentimes, aggression is labeled conduct disorder, and people don't look beyond that about, are they feeling hopeless? Are they having thoughts of suicide? Is this just a way of expressing what they can't express in another way? Are they being reckless? Are they taking risks? Oftentimes we've had, particularly boys, in cars will recklessly drive a car or will recklessly do something which just seems like reckless teenage behavior, but we have found oftentimes it is a cry for help, that they truly are having thoughts of suicide and don't know what to do other than engage in a reckless behavior that might potentially cause them to lose their life. So let's talk about changes you might see. Changes in personality, particularly for those kids that you might see with street outreach or a runaway homeless youth shelter. If when you first met them, they were very agitated and angry, and then their behavior has changed from the baseline from angry and agitated to suddenly calm and resolved, as though they have it all figured out and everything is going to, they're going to take care of things. That's one change you may see. Or if they were previously, sunny, easy to get along with, were able to handle things and then become suddenly withdrawn, sleeping a lot, refusing to go to activities, refusing to engage with other kids in the shelter or with street outreach programs, anything that changes from their baseline behavior. Also, behavior that is out of character. Are they really irritable? Are they doing some other behavior that is not part of their normal pattern of behavior? Now, I know it's a challenge if you run a short-term shelter and you don't see them for more than 3, 4, or 5 days, but you can assess behavioral changes because sometimes they'll go through rapid behavioral changes. Sleeping patterns, going from excessive sleeping to staying up all night and being agitated. Any of those things, or from being extremely agitated to sleeping a lot. Eating habits, they no longer have any appetite, or they're just kind of compulsively eating or stress eating. Losing interest in friends, hobbies, personal appearances. You can see that within the shelter, within street outreach programs, or in general life, because these things all apply to the people in our life. If we see a sudden improvement after a period of being withdrawn or down. So those are the changes that you may see. And as I said, you may see one of these, you may see all of these, but all are something to be considered and not just passed off. Okay. So what are threats? Threats are statements like, how long does it take to bleed to death? Or other threats like, I won't be around much longer, or you would be better off without me. Making plans such as studying ways to die or obtaining the means to self-inflict injury or death. Suicide attempts. Do they happen in youth shelters? Yes. I've seen situations where one youth in one of the shelters had displayed suicidal ideation over the course of their stay. And one time when they were feeling particularly suicidal, they jumped out of the second floor window of the shelter. I've seen also kids attempting to bring in razor blades, not for the intent of harming others, but to harm themselves. So those are things that you need to put together with the picture that you are presented. So as I said, making plans such as study ways to injury or death. And another thing that we do see around communities is the phenomenon of community guns or knives. And the kids seem to know where the community guns are hidden or the community knives, which is particularly dangerous when our trafficked, runaway, and homeless youth know where these are and if they're actively suicidal. Okay? Another thing is suicide attempts, which is important when you do intake, that you ask about prior suicidal behavior. Will that trigger anything? No, it won't. Question for you is, you should have a reliable, rapid suicide screening tool. In my practice and work, we always use the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale, which talks about past behavior, and it's a 3 or 4 question screener. There are longer forms, but and you don't have to be a clinician to use that, but you need to have some kind of assessment to find out about suicide attempts, because prior suicide attempts or exposure to suicide is a good predictor for future behavior. Okay. So situations can also contribute to suicidal ideation, like getting in trouble at school, in the shelter, in the community, or with law enforcement. Those are situational, and those particularly we found with boys can cause to an impulsive suicide attempt or completion. Recent losses, if somebody in their family or somebody they know in their community recently died during gun violence, of COVID, it leaves the youth with an overwhelming sense of loss. And because we don't have as many eyes on the youth, we cannot always gauge how they are reacting, if anybody's helping them with their grief. So that is a really important situational loss, especially now in the time of COVID. Changes in life that feel overwhelming. I can't stress enough how being trafficked, runaway, and homeless can be and is that overwhelming. Okay? So being exposed to the suicide or death of a peer under any circumstances is very important, and you should be vigilant about that. So what do you need to keep the youth safe? So these help decrease the risk factors and increase protective factors. Now, during COVID, some of these are difficult, but if you are able to, and you're able to socially distance, meet the youth in person. That connectedness can often be a very impactful way to interrupt and mitigate those thoughts of suicide. Ask direct questions. And I always tell my students this, ask direct questions, but don't sit there with a clipboard with a screening tool. From what I'm seeing, you've been very agitated lately, but you seem sad at the same time. You aren't your usual self. You aren't getting online for your classes. Sometimes when people act like that, they're having thoughts of suicide. So I always say, ask the direct question after you tell them what you have been seeing. Now, there had been some thoughts in years past that if you ask the direct question, it will put the thought in their head. Research done by the experts at Columbia University have proven time and time again, Dr. Maddie Gould, if anybody wants to research that, that asking directly about suicide does not cause somebody to become suicidal. If anything, it helps that person, whether it's youth or an adult, have a chance to talk about their thoughts of suicide, perhaps for the first time. So ask the direct question, are you having thoughts of suicide? Don't beat around the bush and say, are you thinking of harming yourself? Because harming themselves might be something entirely different than having thoughts of suicide. But that's a whole course. So listen to what they are saying. Listen to their story. It's really important that you listen and not interrupt. Watch for warning signs. Share your knowledge, and the warning signs we've talked about. Share your knowledge about help is available. We can make a suicide safety plan to help keep them safe, which is different than a safety plan for exiting trafficking. But I can send people resources for that. Share, as I said, share your knowledge. Ask about lethal means. Clinically, you would probably say, if you were thinking about suicide, what were you thinking about doing? You can say it that way, or you could say, do you have access to firearms? Do you have access to a knife? Do you have access to pills, other substances? Okay. Now, I know some of you out there thinking, I'm not a clinician, I'm a safe harbor coordinator. I can't ask these questions. Yes, you can. Okay. Request a mental health checkups. That is important, particularly if you're in the shelter situation and you see those going on. Many areas, including our area, have crisis teams that will come to your shelter or crisis areas in your local hospitals. And call for help. You don't have to ask these questions alone. Matter of fact, it's preferable if you think a youth is actively suicidal or has suicidal ideation to have your supervisor or another person in your program there with you. You don't have to do it alone. And I recommend you don't do it alone. Okay? So how do we help at-risk youth when we can't have frequent contact? What are your ideas? How often do we check in? In person, virtually, challenges or success? You can type those in the Q&As or in the chat box. Christine, if we get some feedback, we can talk about this. So what are your ideas about to help at-risk youth when we can't have frequent contact? How often do you check in? Do you check in person, virtually, challenges, successes?
Some people are sharing every other day.
Okay.
I try to check in the kids on my caseload at least weekly, sometimes over the weekend if they've had a particularly difficult week.
Good.
And I think Amanda brings up a good point, like knowing what's going on in the lives of the kids we serve is very important. Vanessa says weekly or on an as-needed basis, every 24 hours, depending on the level of ideation. Some kids have minimal use to phones, so instead I will send a letter or note cards. I think that's great. Awesome. And that's so personalized too. I think that's fabulous. As a caseworker, I check in weekly. I try to know what is going on in the beginning of the week and at the ending of the week.
Anybody else? Those are really
I'm
great.
sorry, I missed one. We follow the youth's lead. That's great. Some prefer daily or every other day. Others prefer a structured schedule for meetings, so something they can look forward to and plan on.
Good. And are you doing this in person or virtually, or you're following the youth's lead on that? And any challenges or successes?
Tara says they're back to in-person. Joan says they're doing both in-person and phone. We're doing a mix, says Aaliyah. Socially distant in-person work and a mix of virtual. Damaris, I'm sorry, I hope I said that correct, says I try in-person best. Both. But Vanessa says they also use text messaging.
Okay, that's a very good way, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that's a very good way to check in. Okay, any challenges or successes?
Other people are also saying they use text messaging because it's great for the kids. I agree. Nicole says they still do in person as much as possible.
Okay, challenges, successes?
Some people are also using Zoom 2 to 3 times a week. Sorry, folks, I didn't see the Q&A box. Jeremiah says they're in a facility, so they check in personally.
Any
A
successes?
challenge that Amanda said was when some kids fall off the grid, their caregivers are also not available or engaged actively in their care, and that can be challenging. Very much so, yes.
And worrisome.
Yes, very. Andrea says, many of my teens aren't responding to texts, etc., even though they were very active prior to COVID, and it may not be safe for me to send them something in the mail. My team is all working mostly remotely. Some of them don't want to do video chat. Fair. Text and in person seems to be the best. Youth seem to be more engaged and receptive. That's something we found fascinating in our conversations as well. A challenge, being able to find agencies that are accepting new clients at this time for counseling. That came from a law enforcement agent.
Very cool.
Being able to keep track, like others mentioned, they use WhatsApp, FaceTime, Zoom, in-person and text, and they try to collaborate with everyone involved in the youth's life to make sure everyone's on the same page. Housing is a big challenge, which we know with our population is always a struggle. This is great, guys.
It is. This is fantastic.
The
Successes.
waiting process is a big challenge. Yes, for
Yep.
sure.
Yeah, it is a huge challenge to find mental health help when we need it, because we need it, you know, if a youth is actively suicidal or, you know, has persistent acute suicidal ideation, we need them attended to right then and there. And sometimes it's frustrating because, you know, it takes them to the emergency department and they're discharged in less than 24 hours. And we know it's urgent, you know, because they have the means, they have the history, but then they're discharged and you can't get them in to see a clinician for 2 or 3 months. Very, very difficult situation. Successes, and then we'll move on.
I did just want to add one more quick challenge that
Sure.
Jeremiah brought up, which I think is so important and that many of us probably haven't thought about, is it is my understanding, and Jeremiah, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, that he is in a facility and the strict COVID protocols involving the parents being on site. I assume that means they're not allowed on site, and that can be challenging and virtually is not effective for the parents. Deborah agrees with him.
Yeah. That's true, because you take youth who are already at risk for suicide, feeling disconnected, you know, even though sometimes their family systems are dysfunctional, they're still a support system and they still have meaning in their lives. So that is a big challenge, very big challenge. Successes?
I think people are being humble and don't want to toot their own horn, but I'm sure everyone's doing great work. So.
Yes, excellent. But we like it when you toot your own horn, so.
I do.
So for those who can meet in person, you'll get more cues when you see a teen face to face. It's easier to look for changes in behavior, cut marks or bandages on a young person's wrist. Now, a couple of things about that. Oftentimes youth who cut, it isn't always with suicidal intent. What we call, you know, cutting without suicidal intent is usually used as a stress reliever. It can be a dangerous stress reliever because they can cut too deeply. So if possible, when you're in person, you can ascertain whether they're cutting to relieve stress or to relieve, it defers the pain that they're feeling to the actual physical pain away from their psychological pain. Or are those cuts from a prior suicide attempt? So you have to ascertain whether there's suicidal intent or an intent to just temporarily ease their pain and transfer it to physical pain. The smell of alcohol, or I didn't add evidence of substance use. And when you meet in person, you can see better what youth are withdrawn or non-communicative. I mean, you can see it over Zoom and the other mediums, but it's easier when you're in person. So just quickly, how do we successfully do this in COVID? Just a couple examples of what has worked for you. When have you been able to see these things better? More so than pre-COVID. Well, you can use your senses when you meet in person for those socially distanced times. Even though I'm a strong proponent of Zoom, I like to go to the shelter and visit the kids that we have that's in a shelter, because you can get this sense of using your eyes, your hearing, your seeing, your nose, your gut, which, as I said, we can see on Zoom, but we can't see, hear, smell, touch. We can't touch during that. Okay. Okay. So as I said, ask direct questions. Don't be afraid to ask if they're considering suicide, if they've made a plan or have taken any steps towards suicide. Asking doesn't increase the risk, as we talked about. If anybody wants, I'll provide a copy of the study by Dr. Madeline Gould from Columbia University. Avoid asking in a way that's abrupt or intrusive. As I also always tell my students, and when I do assist training, applied suicide intervention training, one thing not to do is like, so are you thinking about suicide? That never works or rarely works. The youth and adults want to please you, so they'll tell you, oh, no, I'm not thinking about suicide. And then are surprised when they go and attempt suicide hours after we have talked to them. So try asking open-ended and non-threatening questions until the adolescent is more comfortable. How are things going since you've come to the shelter? So things to consider once you've asked the question. Being able to talk through their problems will reduce the risk of suicide, and I'm sure you all are very adept at doing that. If the youth admits that they've been thinking about suicide and has made a plan or taken steps like stored up pills, obtained a weapon, as a person is at high risk and needs to be supervised until help can be secured. I'll be interested to hear how we can do that in times of COVID. So if the answer is yes to the above, they will need immediate mental health assessment and further mental health services. As I said, we've seen an uptick in suicidal ideation, suicide attempts needing to go to the emergency department, with kind of 60-40 success in getting the youth admitted. Okay. So as far as asking, a teen who's thought about suicide but not taken any steps, you need to ask more questions. Has the youth thought about and rejected the idea of suicide? Were the suicidal thoughts recent or a long time ago? How seriously has the youth considered suicide? Are the problems in his or her life getting better or worse? It's a very simple screening that you can do. It gives a whole lot of information. If you do have the crisis team come, or you do take the youth to the emergency department or crisis unit, it gives good information to the admitting or the person or the crisis team stuff, because you want to gather as much information as you can to give to the ED, to give to the treating clinician. More information helps the youth in a very important way, okay? Can't stress enough about listening, being direct, asking questions, but listening to the youth shows you care. Their story about trafficking is probably interwoven into their thoughts of suicide. So it's really important we listen to that. And as you all know, one thing we don't want to do is say, well, when I felt like this, blah, 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 blah. We need to listen to them. And that's the way we can support them best during these difficult times. Explain that they can come to you with problems, even if they're things that the youth has already discussed with a caseworker. And children and adults don't often understand the roles of different adults in their life well enough to know who they should tell. So they may assume that when they told one of the shelter staff something, that you know that as well. So it's important that, not that they necessarily have to be re-traumatized through telling their story, but they don't understand that you may not have learned what the shelter staff told them before. So just be aware of that. Okay, so having a greater number of risk factor warning signs is a cause for serious concern, but you may not be in the position to see all of their behaviors. As I said, it's really important you tell other adults who have more regular contact, caseworkers, treatment providers, foster parents, when you observe something troubling. Make sure you have signed release. All advocates ask youth for permission before sharing concerns with others, but check your mental hygiene law about dangers themselves or others if they're an imminent risk. We in Schenectady have our critical team meetings, and all the providers, we have weekly meetings to talk about, with releases, to talk about, and we bring up about suicide risk and those kinds of things. And if the youth is in shelter, the shelter provider is included in that. And we find that very helpful and a very efficient way to get the youth to the emergency department, hopefully admitted, and hopefully moved up the line to getting the mental health care that they need. Okay, everybody, if you remember one number, it is the 1-800-273-TALK 8255. It isn't just for individuals considering suicide. It's also a resource for you who want to help someone in crisis. Familiarize yourself with local and county mental health resources. Many counties have crisis teams or crisis walking capability where they can come and formally assess the youth for suicidality, suicide safety plannings, and next steps to keep it safe. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline has rescue capabilities as well. Texting support is also available to teens and your staff. So that's a great help. I know they've been a bit slower to respond during COVID, simply because they're pretty much all volunteer based, and all the volunteers are trained in applied suicide intervention skills. But during COVID, they've had a bit of trouble manning the lines 24 hours a day. But they do also present in multiple languages, okay? We talked about lethal mean. Find out how accessible firearms or potentially lethal drugs are. As I talked about, at least in my community and in Albany, I know there are community firearms and guns and drugs are readily accessible. But youth often know where firearms are hidden or how to get into locked cabinets to reach them. If you want to learn more, you can visit meansmatter.org for research and practical information on that. We talked a little bit about deliberate injuries, take them seriously. And I'm talking fast because I know we're running out of time. So some behaviors are a statement of identity or a result of peer pressure, but they also can be a cry for attention or expression of desperation, hopelessness, or result of suicidal thought. No matter what the cause, intentional self-harm should be addressed with youth and evaluated by a mental health professional. And that includes about cutting. We were talking about, while it's good for you to know the intent, you really need to tell their mental health provider or when they go to the emergency department for that, okay? Promote connections. Transitions such as the end of the relationship, moving or changing or leaving school, are risk factors for the youth. Runaway and homeless youth, as we know, are more vulnerable. Try to minimize the number of transitions that youth make. That's why it's good when youth are in shelter, that they continue with their schoolwork, even if it's online, to maintain those connections, along with connections with caring adults, which is an important risk factor. I'm going to move along here. So trust your instincts. If your opinion differs from the parents or external caseworkers, speak to your supervisor or the mental health professional on your care team. And make sure your at-risk youth can contact you directly if they need you. And also make sure they have the number of another trusted adult or crisis hotline if you're not reachable. Okay. Be willing to talk and listen. Take time to explain your role and others involved in their life. A sense of control over one's life and feeling connected and having close relationships are protective factors. As experts advise that advocates listen to questions, don't just anticipate, because children often have questions that are different than you'd think they'd have. Many children or teens believe their situation is part to them being bad or not trying hard enough. So think about that in the context of trafficked, runaway, and homeless youth. Address your own stress. I can't talk about this enough. You need to take care of your compassion fatigue. You work with youth in crisis on a daily basis and take its toll on you. You work incredibly hard on behalf of our trafficked, runaway, and homeless youth. And sometimes bad outcomes cannot be prevented. Make sure you take care of yourself. If you need to talk to a counselor, please do it. You have to make peace with sometimes of bad outcomes and use stress reduction methods to combat daily frustrations. And if you yourself are thinking about harming yourself, call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Okay. LGBTQ youth are often feeling isolated and sad, which puts them at higher risk of self-harm. Other factors that may put sexual minority youth at risk for suicide or other self-harm are non-conforming gender roles, fears or rejection relating to coming out, particularly of young children, harassment or other victimization related to sexual identity, and stressors such as lack of family or community support, and certainly exploitation, as we talked about, the self-generated images and sex abuse material that may be out there. Okay. So same kind of protective factors, support for families, communities, and schools, using activities that increase their self-esteem, participation in social networks such as the Gay Straight Alliance Project 10, parents, families, and friends of lesbian and gays, positive portrayals of sexual minorities in the media, coping mechanisms. Adult working with these youth must be supportive, non-judgmental, and sensitive. Really important resource that I've worked with in the past is the Trevor Helpline. It's a 24-hour confidential suicide prevention hotline for gay and questioning youth. You can call the number that's listed, and that will be available to you. Each of your counties have a suicide prevention coalition. A very good resource is the Suicide Prevention Center of New York, which I helped put together long ago and far away. And trainings that you can access in your community if you haven't already. Assist Applied Suicide Intervention Skills Training is a 2-day intensive training that helps you intervene with persons at risk for suicide and helps them connect you with that. I'm a trainer. Anybody in the capital region, if you want a training, I can get a couple of other certified trainers and we can do that for you. Safe Talk is suicide awareness for everyone. Tell, ask, listen, keep safe. That's a 3-hour training. QPR is question, persuade, and refer, a 1.5 general overview about suicide prevention. And again, contact the Suicide Prevention Center of New York State, and they can provide information on those trainings to you as well. We talked about the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Okay, these are resources for you. The Trevor Lifeline, that's the 24-hour crisis intervention and suicide prevention lifeline, an excellent resource. I've known our youth that have used that and it's been helpful. Trevor Chat is a free, confidential, secure instant messaging service for LGBTQ youth. And Trevor Text, the number is there. Again, an excellent resource. And these are more. Trevor Lifeguard, Trevor Care Training, Trevor Ally Training, LGBTQ on campus, step in, speak up. Model school district policy for suicide prevention, coming out as you, and the Trevor Support Center. And these will be all available for you. The JED Foundation is also a good resource about information about emotional health issues, and you can also text to them. Questions? It is our time for questions.
Thank you so much, Melanie. I am just processing all of this. I want us all to just take a deep breath for a minute. This was a lot to process.
It is.
Just a quick reminder, folks, I know we talked about it in the beginning and Robin mentioned it. If you have a question for Melanie or just something you'd like to share with the group, the Q&A box is at the bottom of your screen and we will make sure she gets to that. I actually do have a quick question for you, Melanie.
Sure.
You mentioned the rapid, reliable suicide screening tool. How do folks access that? Which I think is the first question, the most important one. And I think you already touched on this. How is it administered? Is it just through casual conversation, similar to the trafficking screening tool that we use? Like you said, you don't want to be sitting there with a clipboard firing off questions. So how do you suggest they go about that?
Okay, so first about administration, we do it like the rapid indicator. You do it just in conversation. That's why I recommend the screener as opposed to the longer tool, because it's just 3 or 4 questions and it's something you can easily review before you do it and ask the questions. Now, how do you access it? You can Google the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale. It will bring you to the Columbia site, Dr. Kelly Posner, who I've worked with a lot on this, and she provides an online training that takes you half an hour. You can print out the screener. Don't print out the long form. Print out the screener and you can use it. And one of the reasons that I particularly like that tool is because it is rapid, it is succinct, it gathers previous suicidal behavior. It has been tested for reliability and validity. It's available in many different languages, and it's really easy to learn, and you don't have to be a clinician. It can be done at intake. We used to recommend doing it at every encounter, because it literally takes 5 minutes to do, but it can and does save a life. So
that's wonderful. I love how it's just 3 to 4 questions. You know, and that's one of the things I enjoy about our rapid tool is that we're not sitting there with the clipboard firing off questions. We are, those of us who work with kids on a daily basis know that the minute they feel they're being confronted or interrogated, they tend to shut down. So they're not going to maybe disclose truthfully. Just engaging with them in normal conversation is absolutely more effective, and you're way more likely to build a rapport with them, most importantly, and get the answers that you absolutely need. So that's super important.
Yeah.
There is a question in the box. Is it possible for a teen to hide their plans until the end, or is it that, or do you feel that it is loved ones and parents missing cues?
From all my years' experience, I find it's loved ones missing cues, kind of denying, not seeing what they don't want to see, because having done this for many, many decades, the cues are out there, but the thing, we as parents or friends will say, well, it's just today was a bad day. It was a rainy day. It was a snowy day. It was, the teacher yelled at him at school, or, her boyfriend made a nasty comment, those kinds of things. It's easy to pass it off because it's hard to deal with somebody in your universe being suicidal. I have a stepson who's actively suicidal often. And it's been a challenge because my husband would tend to be, it's this or this, it's not that. So from personal experience and decades of professional experience, the cues are there. It's very rare that the youth or the adult doesn't show some cue.
Right. I have another question. So you gave us some great and very alarming statistics in the very beginning of the presentation. You know, it's gone up 90%. That's staggering and alarming and frightening. Can you tell us, and you may have mentioned this, so I apologize if you did and I missed it, where that data derives from and how that data came to be?
That was, I got that from Polaris, looking at the data, the call-in data, and
And can you tell people who Polaris is in case they aren't familiar? Although I'm sure everyone is, but I just like to cover my ground.
Well, Polaris is a national, possibly international, anti-trafficking organization that actually hosts the national anti-trafficking hotline and a huge resource center. So
they're wonderful. We have a comment from Jeremiah. Denial as a parent is the first step in not helping your child that feels or has thoughts of suicide. Very, very true. So many people saying thank you. This is a lot of resources. And yes, for people who are asking, we will get you all these great resources and websites and phone numbers so you have them on hand. Maybe make a little tip sheet for you because there's so many of them and we want you to be able to utilize them as best as you can. And I do, go ahead, Melanie.
Oh, just one resource I forgot to tell you. There are a number of apps out there for suicide safety planning based on Dr. Barbara Stanley and Dr. Greg Brown's suicide safety planning. You can Google those safety planning apps and you can use them when you work with your youth to make a suicide safety plan. And you know, you'll see the differences between that and a safety plan to get somebody out of trafficking. Both equally as important, but you know, it gives the youth the resources to help themselves stay alive.
Mm-hmm. So. Absolutely. Yes, Linda, to answer your question, this will be recorded and put up for later viewing, so you can share it with staff, both that are current staff or if you bring on new staff. You know, in the future, this is obviously essential to the work that we do every day. So yes, it's one of the reasons we're trying to record all of this because we feel it's super important. And I think my biggest takeaway has been how important it is for us as service providers to listen. So much happens. We are processing so many things at the same time and thinking of our caseloads and forms that we need to fill out and paperwork that needs to be done, that we could miss things if we're not really engaged in the conversation. I took a class in grad school, and one of the most important things the professor said was communication is 70% listening and 30% speaking. And I think that just in your daily communications with people, that's such an important thing to remember. Jeremiah says, this was fantastic. I feel honored to be a part of it. So kudos, Melanie, that's amazing. What about staff and use of CISM so that they can process what the staff are hearing and processing? This will allow staff release when they are being overwhelmed.
Okay, critical incident stress management. That's fine too. Whatever you know, works to relieve stress, whatever your team mechanism is. I can't stress enough the importance of debriefing after an incident, which I know CISM emphasizes. If you aren't trained in that and you can't do it, debriefing, having a supervisor or someone you can have for support be sitting in on those situations or be informed for your sanity and your support, because this is a very stressful situation. So
absolutely. And I think that's a great spot to kind of put a bow on this, so to speak. It is also happens to be World Mental Health Awareness Day. So it is very appropriate that we are sharing this very important topic today. I want to make sure that I stress that if this was triggering for you or heavy, it is very heavy, to make sure you do some self-care, take a walk, put on a funny show, have a dance party, eat some ice cream, whatever makes you happy, and will let you process everything you heard today. Make sure you're doing that in your everyday life. We can't take care of others unless we're taking care of ourselves. That's so essential to the work we do. I want to give a very, 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 very special thank you to Melanie. She is always a very active member of our Safe Harbor community, and we were happy to have her with us today. I would like to thank all of you for your participation and engagement and I already said participation. See, I need to go eat some ice cream. This is what's happening. And I look forward to seeing all of you tomorrow. Take care, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'm still a resource if you need to contact me.
Yes, we will get out Melanie's information, I promise.
Thanks. All right. Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.